Hundreds of miles offshore, a boat tried to signal a message to the communications center on land. This would be a huge step for communication and this would go through. As they waited patiently back on land, they heard a beep. Now it would be the start of long-range communication for radios.
You're listening to WJHS 91.5, The Eagle. Welcome to Media in the Making, a podcast where we take a look at the evolution of media from the 1600s all the way to present day 2022. In this podcast series, we ask, how have different forms of media evolved and changed culture? In Media in the Making, where media and culture are always changing. Now let's take a step back in time.
Hi, my name is Austin, and this is Tyler.
Hello.
We're going to be talking about the evolution of the radio and how it affected culture. In 1895, the radio was invented by a man named Guglielmo Marconi, but the radio didn't make its first official signal until 1901. This was the first signal by the radio and was a huge invention in the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, the first thing the radio was really used for was boat communication. This affected the way communication worked and helped make boats safer as they were able to communicate with others on land. Being able to send out signals to other boats and people on land helped evolve the communication system.
As we entered the 1910s, the radio evolved even more, with more radio signals and waves transmissions being more possible, and by the time the U.S. entered the war in 1914, the radio system had evolved even more. During the war, the radio was mostly used as a Morse code system, and this helped a lot of countries throughout the war. The radio system was still nowhere near being complete, but Morse code was a huge step in the right direction for the radios. In 1917, a guy named Edwin Howard Armstrong helped improve the radio by making it less static and improved it by increasing the selectivity and amplification. Several years later, Edwin would invent the FM radio, but we will talk about that in a little bit.
As we reached the early 1920s, the radio became a lot more popular and radio news would make its first official appearance in the 1920s. A company called NBC and a company called CBS would begin running on the radio. With the radio turning into a news outlet, it extremely boosted its popularity and a lot of people wanted a radio in the early 1920s. This radio affected the culture a lot in the 1920s by opening up a broader range of cultures to everyone who listened to the radio. With people being able to connect from coast to coast, the radio helped people learn about others on the opposite side of the country. The country being more connected and more people tuning into the radio still needed to improve, and throughout the early 1920s and 1930s, the technology improved and advanced a lot, allowing there to be less wires with the radios, but what channel were they tuning into and how were the FM and AM radio invented?
In 1912, Edwin Howard Armstrong amplified the radio signals by pushing out the current to the highest level of amplification. He also discovered the key to continuous wave transmission, which became the basics of AM radio. In 1933, Edward Howard Armstrong would also develop the FM radio. The FM radio, or the frequency modulation, was invented to help solve the static interference of the AM radio. To do this, Howard would have to change the frequency of the radio, and that would make the FM radio. Lastly, we want to talk about the creator of the radio, Guglielmo Marconi. Before radio waves were a thing, the way ships at sea was by sending a note in a bottle and praying someone would get it and send help. At this time, the world did have a radio, but it had to be connected by a long wire or else it wouldn't work. However, this all changed when a man named Guglielmo Marconi changed the radio forever. Marconi was born in Palazzo Marscalchi, Italy. It is a place where great inventors have created many amazing things, and when Marconi was old enough, he decided to dedicate his life to electrical engineering. His parents were very supportive of him and gave him funds and a laboratory to conduct his studies. He had been testing and trying to find a way to make the telegraph go wireless. He had made a basic telegraph that could send out radio waves, and he had also made a receiving tower out of tall metal rods and a giant sheet metal that would catch the radio waves sent to it.
Marconi took his invention outside and told his butler to take a rifle and the receiver and walk straight for 100 yards. The guy walked for 100 yards through trees and sent up the radio receiver. He was told to fire a shot in the air when he received the message. Marconi tapped on his telegraph, sent the radio waves in the general to the receiver. Because his telegraph can only send radio waves in a certain direction and not all over the places like radios nowadays can. His telegraph was first ever used to send radio messages over the Atlantic Ocean and was successful. His radio was installed in most boats as a better means of communication. Marconi had a big impact on our lives and how we lived them. Marconi died in Rome, Italy in 1937. During that time, all radio stations had a moment of silence in his honor.
Now that we have taken a look back in the past and seen how much the radio has changed and how much it has affected our culture, we want to say that without the radio, people have been able to learn about others across the country and experience different varieties of culture. Since back in the 1920s and 30s, it was harder to connect with people, and having the radio allowed people to connect with each other.
Media in the Making is brought to you by WJHS 91.5 and Eagle Tech Academy Mass Media classes. Media in the Making, teaching you about the evolution of media throughout history and its effects on culture. For more from the students, this podcast series is on the 91.5 website, WJHS91.5.org. Thank you for joining.